The existing records showed no trace of such an arrival, but those of the previous day had still to be received. After assuring myself that Mr. Lloyd George's personal guard, he was at the moment at Downing Street, had been warned and reinforced, I thought myself entitled to a few hours' sleep, which I took at Scotland Yard itself. No mention of the matter, I should say in passing, was made to the Prime Minister. As I have said, threats of assassination were reported frequently to Scotland Yard, and had the intended victim been told of all of them, he would always have been on tenterhooks. For courageous as a man may be, and Mr. Lloyd George has never shown himself short of courage, he cannot be expected to produce his best brain work if he is continually haunted by the thought that an assassin's bullet lurks around the next corner. I did ask, however, that I might be kept closely in touch with the Prime Minister's movements during the next few days, in order that I myself might always be somewhere handy, so that if Schleicher put in an appearance, I would be ready to identify him. Nothing happened during the next day. At Scotland Yard, it was reported that Schleicher apparently had not yet landed in England. The records had now been more carefully examined, but no man answering his physical description and claiming to be a Swede or any other Scandinavian had arrived. The only one whose description in any way fitted Schleicher was an American government official who had been visiting Sweden on some minor war service and was returning to America via England. I spent the whole of the day at Downing Street. For the time being, I was a member of the special section of Scotland Yard. Mr. Lloyd George was engaged in conference for the whole of the morning and afternoon. In the evening he went over to the House of Commons, and I went with him, although he did not know it. There were quite a number of people about Whitehall, but no signs of Schleicher. Possibly I had come on a fool's errand, after all. Perhaps he was merely indulging an idle boast when he said that he was coming to do the job. Alternatively, perhaps he had found it more difficult to get into England than he had thought. Maybe his council cousin in Sweden had been sensible enough to send him home. The next morning, however, I got the shock of my life. Sundry small parcels had arrived at 10 Downing Street, and Mr. Lloyd George's manservant was sorting them out. Among them was a box of cigars. Mr. Lloyd George is fond of a good cigar, I hear, I commented casually. Yes, said the man, he is, but I don't know where these can have come from. I certainly didn't order them. They must be from some admirer of his. He was opening the package as he spoke. Yes, he continued, and someone who knows his taste too. This is his favorite cigar. Strange, though, he went on, there isn't any note inside. There usually is. I wonder who sent them. He fingered the brown paper cover and examined it. There was no postmark, for the parcel had been delivered by hand. He called to the hall boy. How did these cigars get here, George? Did anybody leave a card with them? No, said the hall boy. A messenger boy brought them. Just handed them in. Said for Mr. Lloyd George, and popped off again. I had to sign a receipt, of course. That was all right, wasn't it? The butler asked him one or two more questions, but I was not listening. I was looking hard at the address, which had been written on the brown paper. The easiest way to find out the nationality of a man is to study his handwriting, for nearly every European country has a different method of teaching writing. There is the widest of deviation, for example, between the writing of an Englishman and the writing of a Frenchman. Even if they were writing out the same words in the same language, there are always some letters in particular which are written in a manner peculiar to the country concerned. It is the same with the English and German calligraphy, and as I looked at this address, carefully printed, I saw just 2 or 3 things which made me certain that no Englishman ever wrote it. What was more, that it had been written by a German. Immediately, therefore, I picked up the box of cigars. "I shall take charge of these," I said to the amazed butler. "But what's the matter?" he complained. Perhaps such things were one of his perquisites. "I don't know. I'm not satisfied about them," I insisted. "I want to find out where they came from, George." I called to the hall boy. "This messenger, who was he? Did you know him? What company?" "An ordinary district messenger," he said. "They've got an office just by Trafalgar Square. He may have come from there. I've seen him about often enough. I don't know his name." I called one of the plain-clothes men to me. "Take George up to the district messenger office at once," I ordered. "It is essential that we find out who handed in this parcel to be delivered." That did not take very long. Within half an hour he was back, with the alarming news that the parcel had been handed in for dispatch by a meek-looking little man wearing a blue serge suit, a man who answered in particular to the description of Schleicher. Nor was my consternation lessened when about 2 hours later I was notified by the government laboratory that the cigars were impregnated with aconite poison. I realized now that I had made an elementary and fundamental error. I had completely underestimated the capacity of my opponent. I had never imagined that the meek little man I had interviewed at Krusnoch would ever have the initiative to find out which were Mr. Lloyd George's favorite cigars, much less to make the attempt which I had detected almost by accident. From this moment onwards I decided on drastic measures. Schleicher had proved to be no mean innocent, but an opponent of cunning. He must be treated accordingly. Although Mr. Lloyd George did not know it, his household that night was reminiscent of fiercer and Eastern times, for before his dinner was served, a portion of every one of the dishes, he had 1 or 2 important guests to dinner, was previously fed to one of the domestic cats or dogs, to make perfectly certain that it was innocuous. I have often tried to imagine what the fiery and courageous Welshman would have thought and said had he witnessed this strange scene, but I was taking no risks. He did not go out that night, and after he had retired to bed I contented myself with posting a double guard about the house. Actually, I had no fear of nocturnal attempts, for the approaches to Downing Street literally bristled with uniformed and plain-clothed policemen, and nobody but a fool would attempt to penetrate the cordon with malicious intent. And I had now found out that Schleicher was no fool. This was a Saturday. Mr. Lloyd George's arrangements for the Sunday were immature. until his dinner party was over. Then he instructed his man that he would be going to his country house at Walton Heath first thing in the morning. Immediately I was anxious. I knew something of Mr. Lloyd George's habits, how he loved to roam alone about the Surrey hills, and in them were excellent opportunities for a prospective assassinator, no matter how vigilant a guard might be. I must assume that Schleicher knew of the Prime Minister's normal week-end custom, that is, to go to Walton Heath whenever the affairs of state were not too pressing. He would probably have ascertained this interesting detail from the same paragraph of society chit-chat which told him of Mr. Lloyd George's favorite brand of cigar. The following day, therefore, I decided inwardly, was one of danger. As I thought it over, suddenly I had an idea. I went to the telephone and tried to get through to Clarkson's, on the off chance that someone might be working there on a rush order. The shop, however, was closed, so I got through to Willie Clarkson's private address, for I had known him well in my actor days, before the war. Every actor was bound to know Willie Clarkson. I told him what I wanted, emphasized that it was urgent, and although he was just about to go to bed, he very sportingly agreed to run back to Wardour Street and fit me up with what I wanted. An hour later I met him there, and then this supreme artist in his own line got busy. My scheme will already be obvious. I wanted to rig myself up as Mr. Lloyd George, to take a walk about Walton Heath the following morning, in the hope of attracting Schleicher's attention. So far as the features of the Prime Minister were concerned, the disguise was child's play to a man like Clarkson. Within half an hour I was arrayed in the flowing grey locks and rather ragged moustache which typified the Mr. Lloyd George of that day. I could use no grease paint if I was to work in the open air, but a little imperceptible powder and a few dark lines added the necessary years. My only physical difficulty was that I was very considerably larger than Mr. Lloyd George. Fortunately, however, he had a well-known habit of promenading in a loose cloak. It would be easy for me to get hold of this cloak at his house, and thus arrayed I could, by stooping, suggest the necessary shortage of inches. In any case, this question of detail was not so important as it might have been in other circumstances, for Schleicher would probably never have seen more than photographs of Mr. Lloyd George, and although he might know that he was on the short side, he would certainly have no idea to within an inch or two. So I left Willie Clarkson with sincere and grateful thanks. Having taken off and packed up my disguise, I went down in a car closely following that of Mr. Lloyd George to Walton Heath the following morning. Immediately after breakfast, I made discreet inquiries as to the Prime Minister's plans for the day. I was told that he would probably rest and read in his study for the morning, although he might take a sharp walk to give him an appetite for lunch. The special service men from Scotland Yard, who acted as Mr. Lloyd George's almost unknown and apparently unseen bodyguard, were a very fine lot of fellows, specially selected for such a delicate task. I picked out one who appealed to me, a sergeant marshal, and instructed him to come out with me, first of all revealing my intention. Suitably disguised as Mr. Lloyd George, I proposed to take his favorite walk over the hills, which it would have been quite easy for Schleicher to have ascertained. Marshall, in very plain clothes of course, and apparently a local tradesman, taking his country walk, was to follow me at a distance of 100 yards or so, and to see what happened. As I made the arrangement, I thought that I was indeed playing for safety first, for I knew very well that I could deal with a little whipper-snapper like Schleicher without any difficulty. However, a second man might be handy when I had knocked him out. Marshall was armed, but I was not. I instructed him that only in the gravest emergency was he to use his revolver. We wanted to attract no attention. If possible, the arrest must be carried out without observation at all. Above all, Mr. Lloyd George must have no hint of the proceedings. As I have already said, a man who is controlling the ship of state in such heavy seas as raged about it in 1917 ought not to be bothered by personal details, especially a threat of assassination which might prove to be ludicrous in its execution. I drove in a closed car to the end of the town, well clear from all the houses, for although I ought to be able to deceive a foreigner like Schleicher, I could not so easily take in one of the locals, who might have seen the Prime Minister 100 times. Clear of all traces of human habitation, however, I took up my part. Well enveloped in one of Mr. Lloyd George's voluminous cloaks, and wearing one of the rather nondescript hats which he favored at the time, I strode with his Celtic energy across the rolling downs before me. Facially, my make-up was perfect. My stoop meant that my back was necessarily a little bent, but this was a detail which I felt certain Schleicher would be too unobservant to notice. A good 100 yards behind trailed the faithful Marshal, strolling casually along as if neither time nor anything else mattered. 5 minutes later, I met a man, evidently a local gardener, returning to the town. Without hesitation, he raised his hat and gave me an obsequious good morning. I returned to him one of Mr. Lloyd George's famous smiles. This gave me the necessary confidence. For another mile I met not a soul. I admired the Premier's choice, for surely the little hills about Walton Heath are the finest piece of pleasantness within 50 miles of London. I decided if I ever became a rich man, somewhere in this district would be my country retreat. Enthusiastic as I was at the pleasant beauty about me, I naturally did not allow my mind to stray from the task in hand. From time to time I loitered so that Schleicher, if he were about, should be tempted to reveal himself. Only in passing trees and hedgerows did I proceed with caution. Here a man with a revolver might be lurking, and although I wished to save Mr. Lloyd George's life, I had no desire to lose my own. Just as I had decided, in fact, that my method of approach had been wrong, that I ought to have had Marshall 100 yards in front of me instead of loitering behind, Schleicher was upon me. I had just passed a great tree, whose branches spread far over the path. I had deliberately wandered in my walk as I approached it, so as to be certain that no one was hiding on the farther side. I had neglected to look up above, once again underestimating my opponent, a vital fault that I am afraid has been mine on more than one occasion. But a second after I had passed the tree, I heard a thud on the ground behind me. I had only time to turn round before I found myself faced with my would-be assassin. It was obvious what had happened. He had concealed himself in the branches of the tree and jumped down immediately after I had passed. When I thought it over afterwards, I decided that his scheme was a very poor one. He would be under the impression, of course, that Mr. Lloyd George knew nothing of his projected attempt. If therefore he had come walking towards, or even behind his victim along the path, no notice would have been taken of him. But everyone is on the qui-vive against a man who drops unexpectedly from the branches of a tree. However, at the moment I had no time to think of this, for in a fraction of a second he sprang towards me, and I saw the flash of steel in his hand. I was rather relieved, as a matter of fact. No strength can prevail against a pistol bullet, but if he were going to attempt to stab me, well, I ought to be strong enough to deal with 2 slashers. Again, I found out my mistake. With my left hand, I grabbed his right wrist and held it tightly, but he jumped in the air, swinging his other arm over my right shoulder. His legs closed about me as he kicked and fought with a strength and power which I would not have believed possible. His right wrist wriggled with such intensity that it was all I could do to keep it imprisoned. At last, however, I managed to twist it round so sharply that he gave a cry of pain, and the knife dropped from his fingers. Now I thought, it's all over. Now I've got the little fool. I was too previous. With a howl of rage, he flung himself again upon me, clinging to me viciously with arms and legs. I tried to push him away, to get him a few inches away from me, so that I could get in a good blow that would knock him out. But however hard I struggled, I could make no headway. He clung like a leech, and rather concerned, I grappled with him, hoping that Marshall would come and tear this human limpet from me. There was no sign of Marshall. I would have been even more concerned, perhaps, had I known that in his hurry he had miscalculated the height of a stile, had caught his feet on the top rung, and had temporarily knocked himself silly. As I looked for Marshall, I felt a sudden pain in my neck. For a moment I was too startled to realize what it meant. Then I found that the little brute had bitten me, and bitten me hard. It was not until this moment that I realized what I ought to have known before, that Slasher was no meek and mild patriotic fool, but a madman. There was no room for doubt, as he struggled and scratched. One fist pulled a handful of hair from my head. It was very fortunate that it came from the wig, and not from my scalp, or it might have been very painful. The other hand, with fingers curved like claws, made a grab at my right eye. Only by withdrawal of an inch did I avoid its vicious clutch. Even then his fingernails left deep scratches down my right cheek. This was absurd, I decided. I was big enough to take on a man like Slasher. with one hand, and mad or not mad, I must do something desperate, or whatever reputation I ever had would completely disappear. So I left off the use of brute force for the moment and resorted to strategy. Still hugging one another like a couple of loving marmosets, I retreated a couple of yards to the tree. Propping my back against the trunk, I used an old trick which all-in wrestlers know very well. I lifted my right knee between his legs with considerable force. With a howl, his grip relaxed just for a moment, and in that moment I had pushed him free and caught him a terrific uppercut under the chin. It was the sort of blow that would have knocked out a heavyweight, and Schleicher went like a fallen tree to the ground. I took no chances but rushed to his side. Yes, it seemed as if I had done the trick this time. Then I looked anxiously again down the path for Marshall, for certainly I would need some help. In any case, I couldn't go back to Walton Heath, a bleeding mess like this. But still there were no signs of my assistant, and I had the horrible thought that perhaps Schleicher had accomplices who had disposed of the Prime Minister's guard. I took a step or two down the path to see if I could see anything of Marshall. It was a foolish thing to do, perhaps, although I had thought that the blow I had given Schleicher would put him to sleep for a considerable time. But suddenly again I heard movements behind me. Turning round, I saw Schleicher scrambling to his feet, and if I had any doubt before, I had none now, as I saw his eyes. He was utterly and completely mad. Those eyes glaring at me were not the eyes of a man, but of a beast. It is an insult to most beasts to describe them so. I went for him. I went for him hard. I was careful not to let him get too near. I had the longer reach. As he rushed in, I gave him blow after blow. I felt his nose crush beneath one of my straight rights. Blood spurted from it, and from a cut over his eye. Once I knocked him literally head over heels, but before I could get to him and sit on him, he was up again, snarling like a cornered wolf. At last, flinging himself forward in a rugby tackle, he caught me off my balance, and we went together to the ground. This, however, was his misfortune. I think I have mentioned that I am something of a heavy weight, and I came down with full force across the pit of his stomach, completely winding him. As he fought for his breath, I had no mercy on him whatsoever. This was no time for Queensberry rules. He did actually struggle to his knees, both arms pressed against his tummy, the wind wheezing in his throat, but even as he knelt, as it might be in an attitude of supplication, I bent down and gave him another knockout. This time I knew he would not rise. A minute later, I was very relieved to see Marshall running up the path. He was cursing himself for his clumsiness, which indeed might have been rather unfortunate. However, all's well that ends well, as Shakespeare said, and now our job was done, keeping a very weary eye upon the recumbent form of Schleicher. Marshall began to give a rough dressing to my wounds. Neither of us was quite certain about those ugly bites in the neck. We knew that the bite of a mad dog is dangerous. Well, the bite of a mad man might be equally so. We decided that we would carry Schleicher down to the village at once, so that my wounds could receive immediate and proper attention. When we came to pick him up, however, I found that I had very little strength. Whether it was due to my apprehension about the bites, or whether the fight had taken more out of me than I knew, and I assure you that it was by no means a pleasant experience, particularly from the moment when I realized that Schleicher was a madman. But when I picked up my end of our victim, I scarcely had the strength to hold him. Marshall, however, was a man of activity and in excellent training, and he got a Nelson grip of Schleicher and carried him easily, fireman fashion, over his shoulder. We made no attempt to bring him round. He was better off for our purpose as he was. We had covered about a quarter of a mile in this fashion, when suddenly I saw Mr. Lloyd George himself coming up the hill. Evidently he was taking his morning's constitutional a little earlier than we had anticipated. Had he come a few minutes earlier, he would have had the shock of his life, for he would have met himself bleeding from wounds in the neck and face. As it was, there was just time to bundle Schleicher behind the hedge, and for me to go with him. Marshall remained on the path. He was well known to the Prime Minister, of course, and in case the Prime Minister should have seen someone on the path, it was well for at least one man to show up. Mr. Lloyd George walked by, throwing Marshall a cheery greeting, and stopping to talk with him for a minute or two. Then he passed on at a spanking pace, never realizing what lay behind the hedge, and never realizing, perhaps to this day, how near to death he had been. Schleicher was never tried, as I had expected. He was found to be mad and unfit to plead, and was consigned to Broadmoor for the rest of his life, in order that I might have a good story to take back with me to GHQ at Krasnach. One of the leading newspapers was asked to print a small paragraph stating that the man who assaulted an army officer on the Downs near Walton Heath had been found to be mad and had been sent to Broadmoor. I took a cutting of this back with me, and still have it in my possession. I would give you the actual date so that you could turn it up for yourself, but foolishly I did not keep a record and have not troubled to look it up. But it was certainly some time in September 1917, and the paper was the Daily Telegraph. By a strange coincidence, for there are coincidences in spite of their misuse in romantic fiction, Schleicher died on the afternoon of November 11, 1918, while great crowds of people were paying exuberant homage to the man who he had tried to assassinate. It would be an interesting study to trace the course of the war had Schleicher succeeded in his attempt. I do not think there is much doubt, had the war been conducted by someone less energetic than Mr. Lloyd George, it would never have ended in 1918. There is quite a possibility that when it did finish, the issue might not have been quite so successful from our point of view as it was, as we have gained precious little from the actual peace. Goodness knows what would have been our lot under the possible alternative. Chapter 7. After I had made certain that my wounds were of no consequence, and after I had faced the inevitable cross-examination at the War Office, and had made some new arrangements with Mason as regards communications, I got back again to Germany, where once again my reception was of the brightest. My story, how I had disguised myself as a British Army officer, had met Schleicher and had knocked him out, how he had been carted off as mad, was naturally accepted without question, supported as it was by the newspaper cutting, and I was delighted beyond measure when not only my immediate chief but General Ludendorff himself hinted how pleased he was with what I had done. An invitation to dine with Field Marshal Hindenburg was another consequence of my little effort. These dinners with the old Field Marshal always appealed to me, for I liked the old man tremendously. He is still a pleasant memory with me. Since the war I saw him from time to time. Towards the end he was a very, very old man. It was difficult to visualize in him the victor of Tannenberg, and the man whose courage stood up even against the strain of defeat in the last days of the war. A few months ago I had the melancholy duty of attending his funeral. I represented an English newspaper. I sat in that imperative memorial at Tannenberg. All around me were men I recognized. Every German wartime leader who is still alive was there, all except Ludendorff. By this time I was firmly established on the operations side. My appointment was only a junior one, however, and I badly wanted to move up a step or two so as to get further into the inner secrets. Now there was a custom in German staff circles, which was a very good one, and I cordially recommend it to our own headquarters in the event of another war. That is, that all junior staff officers, at any rate, should from time to time serve a few weeks or even months with the fighting units. The advantages are too obvious to discuss, as I was now well in Ludendorff's good books. I suggested that the time had perhaps come when I ought to take my refresher course. I pointed out that I had not served in the trenches for 2 years, and might perhaps be rather out of touch with actual conditions. He agreed that I should do my front-line course without delay. As he said, he had a job waiting for me on my return. So I was appointed temporarily as second in command of a battalion of Jaggers, and a few days later found myself once more on the Ypres front. The battle, which is known as that of Passchendaele, was in progress, and when I saw the conditions under which it was being fought, I bitterly regretted my impetuosity. Why had I not waited a few weeks until the front settled down into the normal winter stalemate? I had imagined that our 1914 winter was as near to hell as anything on earth was ever likely to be, but it was green and pleasant pastures compared with the abomination of desolation in which we now fought. On the German side conditions were intolerable, but we at least had solid concrete pillboxes, which had replaced the impossible trenches. For my countrymen opposite I had nothing but pity, yet a disquieting fear that our high command had somehow taken leave of its senses. Otherwise, surely it would never ask men to fight in conditions which might possibly have suited frogs and toads, but never human beings. But I need not linger on this miserable episode. I lingered long enough in its mud. It has been described often enough, yet it can never be described too often. Suffice it to say that Passchendaele almost broke the spirit of the British Army, a thing no German onslaught or defense had even approached. A new commander emerged on the field of war. The Russians in 1812 pinned their faith on their General Winter. In 1918, the German General von Zell acutely commented, "It was not the genius of Marshal Foch that beat us, but General Tank." And at Passchendaele in 1917, the British were certainly decisively defeated by General Mudd. A few weeks later, I was hurriedly recalled. The Battle of Passchendaele had now completed its weary course, and the British were in temporary possession of a few square miles of utterly useless bog. The price at which these gallons of mud had been purchased can scarcely be calculated. When I reached Corps headquarters, I was instructed to go south at once. Apparently the front was ablaze in a new sector. I was surprised to hear this, for we had heard none of the usual booming of cannon, which inevitably heralded a battle. When I reached Cambrai, however, I found the reason, for the battle was, of course, the great tank attack of November 20th, 1917. The battle has been the subject of as much argument as any in the war. It has been claimed, and rightly claimed, that if only the tank method had been used earlier and in greater force, that if the 500,000 casualties of Passchendaele had been still in the ranks, ready to push home the initial advantage, then the Battle of Cambrai might have been the greatest success of the war. This is all very true, yet I think it just as well to emphasize that even had all those things happened, Cambrai would not have finished the war. We should not have completely broken the German line, but merely have indented another huge salient. For we must remember that we had been stationary so long that we had forgotten how to move, as we discovered to our cost the next year. Further, by this time Russia was as good as out of the war, and already German divisions were being brought from the east to the west. It was the chance arrival of one of these divisions at Cambrai, in fact, which prevented the British from achieving a spectacular success. What struck me most about this battle, however, the first time the Allies had succeeded in surprising the Germans, was the conduct of Ludendorff. I have never known him in better form. He had never differed so vitally from those Allied commanders who let their optimism run away with them. After the results of the first day of battle were known, Ludendorff candidly admitted that he had sustained a severe defeat, but at the same time he announced his intention to the staff and indirectly to the world of wiping it out. We learned to our cost how well he fulfilled that intention. At the time of my last visit to England, it had been obvious that in the near future Germany would begin to transfer troops in considerable numbers from the Russian front. This was one of the principal things which the War Office and GHQ wanted to know, in what quantity the troops were coming over and where they were being concentrated. And it was with these ends in view that I had made a new arrangement with Mason, whereby he would be enabled to decipher such messages as I was able to send, for, as I have often said, I had no faith in the ordinary official methods, nor did I believe in using fantastic ciphers, which would only attract the attention of an intelligent censor. I preferred rather the device which I had found so effective hitherto, that is, a fragment of news concealed in a perfectly harmless and inoffensive letter. Nor were such letters sent at all frequently. It presumed a keen intelligence on the part of the man who was to read it, but by this time Mason and I knew each other very well, and I was perfectly confident that he would get to the bottom of anything that I sent over. I have already described one of the methods by which I was able to give the necessary warning of the impending storm. How that harmless Baden newspaper revealed information of vital importance. In half a dozen similar simple ways, I was able to get my information to the proper quarter, and when the first great German attack broke against the English line on March 21st, 1918, at least it was no surprise. The Arras Street, Quinton area had, for that matter, been forecastled as the scene of the expected attack by a good many thinking officers. Only Sir Henry Wilson's estimate was, as usual, very wide of the mark, and on receiving my confirmatory messages, the staff were fully prepared. In fact, the commander of the Fifth Army, which was to bear the brunt of the attack, shows quite plainly in his book that, although perhaps surprised by the force of the attack, he was not in the least unexpectant of the attack itself. I remember March 21st very well, because I was attached to the entourage of the Kaiser for the day. From time to time, I had met the Kaiser, for reports were sent to him every evening direct from Hindenburg. When the Kaiser was in the vicinity of headquarters, which was quite frequently, Hindenburg would usually report the position on the different fronts himself, but when the Kaiser was at a distance, one of the staff had to travel to do this job. This had fallen to my lot more than once. I know that it is fashionable to decry the Kaiser as the villain of the peace, and to put the blame for everything upon him, that he was, to some extent, responsible for the coming of the war, I suppose no one can deny. In any case, I am not more competent than anyone else to discuss it, but at least I could prove, I think, that he did not do 1/100th part of the things during the war that in popular estimation he was supposed to have done. In fact, I think I have already mentioned that his influence on the conduct of the war was strangely negligible. Once the war had started, all the power in Germany was concentrated in general headquarters. The Reichstag and even the Chancellor had to occupy subordinate positions. General headquarters had now been moved to Spa in Belgium, with Avesnes as a kind of advanced headquarters. We arrived there only a day or two before the breaking of the great attack. I had played a fairly considerable part in the necessary organization, particularly of infantry artillery liaison. I was quickened with admiration for General Bruchmüller, the German artillery expert, who had returned with von Hütter, flushed with the victory at Riga. He was, I think, the most painstaking man that I have ever met, and at the same time one of the most brilliant. I have certainly never known a man who could see actual scenes in his mind's eye without visiting them, and who could think so far ahead. Many and many a time, as I worked with him, I wished that his services could be acquired by the other side. In the afternoon of March 21st, I drove by car into St. Quentin. In the car were the Kaiser and his aide-de-camp. My job was to look after the Emperor and to answer any questions. We advanced over what that morning had been the battlefield. The unburied dead lay about in hundreds. Although the British line had been captured, it had obviously been well defended, for never before had I seen the German dead so thickly strewn. At this moment, I may say, I had no idea that the German advance would go so far. I naturally expected that the British battle positions would be captured. That was quite a usual thing. Even the Allies had captured the German battle positions, times without number. But of course I expected that the British had other positions prepared in the rear, nor had I the faintest idea of the weakness of the British along the front. Although our line of battle showed only 14 divisions in the actual Fifth Army battle area, I presumed that there were at least a dozen other divisions within easy call, of whom we had no exact knowledge. I know now how wrong I was. However, to return to the Kaiser, for one incident of the afternoon has always remained fixed in my memory. He looked sorrowfully at the dead lying about on every hand. He was obviously affected at the sight, although he had seen it many times before. Not only did the German dead so sadden him, but the British too. I saw him take out his own handkerchief and spread it over the mutilated face of a British soldier. Not an act of great utility on a battlefield, but very decent an idea, nevertheless. Then we came across columns of British prisoners. It was then that I got my first shock, for I had not thought that so many had been captured. Inside one of the barbed wire cages was a group of British officers, looking very sick and sorry for themselves, as may be well imagined. Although one or two fairly elderly men were included, most of them were youngsters, obviously almost straight from school, and with only a few months of army service behind them. What an end to all their hopes of glory, to be confined like rats in a wire cage. No wonder that their heads hung low and that they sat silent. But the Kaiser went up to them and began to speak to them. It is well known that his English was as near perfect as can be. He made quite a little speech in intimate fashion. He commiserated with them on their misfortune. At the same time he congratulated them on their bravery, on the way in which they had held their posts. He pointed out that the bitterest ignominy of warfare, that of capture by the enemy, was often the lot of those who had shown the greatest courage and had hung on grimly to their positions until they were completely surrounded. In fact, he made a jolly good and invigorating speech, and he certainly put a new courage into the hearts of those youngsters, who stood in amazement when they recognized that it was the Emperor of Germany who was so speaking to them. I have always remembered that afternoon, and although people may revile the Kaiser as much as they like, I claim that what he did that day was the action of a sportsman. Actually, I think the Kaiser had a deeper humanity than anybody knew. Maybe had he not, in his early days, been under the influence of such a man of iron as Bismarck, his development would have been vastly different. When you have an intelligent and ambitious man who is treated rigorously as a child the moment it is possible to revolt, he will naturally do so. Had Bismarck been a little more understanding, his reign might have lasted longer, and the subsequent history of Europe might have been enormously changed. This, however, is only my own impression of the Kaiser, based on the little incidents which I saw. I hold no special brief for this much discussed world figure. Another leading figure on the German side, too, was a man of humanity. In fact, if I were asked to mention the greatest point of difference between Hindenburg and Ludendorff, it would be this. For Ludendorff was a specialist. He was a man of war, and had no thought for anything else. He was a ruthless man because war is ruthless. It was not that he was a bad-hearted man. On the contrary, his conduct was always straightforward. But he had been brought up in the old Prussian school, and knew no scruples where the success of his country's armies were concerned. Hindenburg, on the other hand, although first and foremost a soldier, was an ordinary man at the same time. I noticed the difference in one incident which happened the same day. When I got back to headquarters, I was describing to Hindenburg the journey with the Emperor, and I mentioned some little scene which I had witnessed. It was in St. Quentin itself. Although the front had now moved several miles away, the town was still under British fire. German columns passing up to the front blocked the bombarded streets, while streams of wounded, the more serious cases carried by British prisoners, were moving slowly back through the town. Close by me, 4 very weary English soldiers laid down the stretcher which they were carrying. The wounded German lying upon it was groaning, and one of the Englishmen bent over him. I too heard the German muttering. Continually he repeated the one word, mutter, mutter. It is a very strange thing that although men may love their wives and their children, it is for their mothers that they call at the moment of death. The Englishman understood the word, so closely akin to its English equivalent. The German was almost unconscious, and the Englishman, with quick wit that distinguishes the Cockney mind, took his cold hand in his own and caressed it softly, whispering gently, "Mother, yes, mother is here." As I told this little story to Hindenburg, I could see how very deeply he was affected. For some minutes he did not speak. Maybe he was thinking of the dying soldier's mother, and maybe of the mother of the Englishman too. Or maybe he was thinking that war, after all, is not the greatest thing in life, and that humanity is greater than war. I don't know, but I do know that he was very fond of telling this story for a considerable time afterwards. I notice, in fact, that he has included it in his memoirs. Among others, he told it to Ludendorff, who was not even interested. As the days went by, I was alarmed at the rapid retreat of the British forces in the Somme area. It might even be possible to knock out the Allies before the Americans arrived in any force. It was with great delight, therefore, that I heard a few days later that the advance had unaccountably slowed up. I was instructed to go to the front as quickly as I could get there, and to see for myself what was happening, for it was the custom on the German side for staff officers to go direct from General Headquarters to any part of the front that might be active. Compare this with the famous epistle of General Joffre on the subject of the complaint about the defenses of Verdun. Now, military experts have argued, and probably will argue for a good many generations, about this battle on the Fifth Army front. It was easily the biggest defeat suffered by either side on the Western Front. Obviously, too, it was within an ace of being decisive, since only improvised and skeleton units in the latter stages of the battle opposed advancing Germans, while between the British and the French, and also between the British Third and Fifth Armies, great gaps had developed. The Germans had only to march onwards, and Amiens lay well within their clutch, and with Amiens gone, it would be tremendously difficult for either the French to the south or the British to the north to retain their positions. If the Germans got through Amiens, indeed, it would mean that the forces in front of them had become so entirely disintegrated that the rupture between the French and British armies would have been complete. Battles would have been fought on two fronts, the British defending the Channel ports and the French Paris, and in such circumstances the Germans might easily have achieved a decisive victory. Yet they did not. They were faced only by a few thousand tremendously tired and dispirited men. A dozen times a day gaps appeared in the line. All kinds of oddments of men were gathered up by the British staff to make up the deficiency. Cooks, batmen, clerks, laborers, all these were hastily armed and put into the line. Many of them had never fired a shot in anger in their lives, but nevertheless they did remarkably well in very difficult circumstances. However, against a concentrated attack by a trained, powerful, and overwhelmingly superior enemy, obviously such a line, feeble and precarious, could not expect to survive. Yet it did. Why? That is the question that historians have to answer. Practically all of them to date have tried to find the explanation in the examination of technical details. They have closely scrutinized all the orders that were issued in the course of the battle, and the events which followed those orders. They have drawn all kinds of deductions, some sensible and some absurd. Their study, in fact, has been exclusively of the military side of the battle. Scarcely one of them has given a thought to the human side. Yet, as I could show, it was the human and not the military element which failed the Germans at this critical moment. I left my car about 3 miles to the east of Albert and took to the road, ready to drop into the maze of trenches at the slightest provocation. Actually, there appeared to be no provocation. One would scarcely have thought that a battle was in progress. The shelling was most casual and intermittent. On the British side there was scarcely any sign of life at all. Suddenly I saw something which startled me, an incident of tremendous meaning. A few hundred yards in front of me was a company of German troops marching up towards the battle. A little to the right of the road was a group of hutments, and the moment they reached them, the Germans as one man broke from their ranks and rushed into the huts. I saw their officers standing and cursing furiously, commanding them to return to their ranks, but not a man took a scrap of notice. I saw one of the officers even draw his revolver and threaten to shoot the man nearest to him if he did not return to his duty, but everything was of no avail. When I reached the spot, I found that one of the huts was a canteen, and the troops were helping themselves liberally to its contents. This was the first time throughout the whole of the war that I had seen such insubordination in the German ranks, and it struck me as being highly significant. Nor was this the whole of the story. The men were marching along loaded by all kinds of souvenirs that they had collected from the British back areas. Mostly these took the form of food, but some men were actually carrying about with them such oddities as brass taps. When eventually I reached Albert, I found even stranger scenes. Men were rolling about the streets blind drunk, saturated in body and clothing with the wine which was being ladled out of barrels in the cellars of the many estaminets. Others were searching for loot among the abandoned houses, and hundreds were trying to get into the Expeditionary Forces canteens near by the station. And as I looked at them, I suddenly realized that here was the explanation of the halt of the advance, for I noticed by their shoulder straps that these were the very regiments who were actually supposed to be in action, who the General Staff fondly imagined were halfway to Amiens. Instead, they were gorging themselves in British canteens, drinking themselves sodden from the copious supplies of wine, and accumulating useless loot. How did it all come about? The explanation is very simple. On the British side, we knew very well that the German submarines were a decided nuisance. A rationing system of food had to be initiated, but at the same time there was no trace of any starvation. On the material side, too, although there was a shortage of a good many things, there was no vital necessity that was missed. Now transfer attention for a moment to Germany. Germany, right from the very first moment of the war, had been almost utterly shut off from the outside world. From the very minute of the declaration of war, the British Navy had maintained that effective stranglehold known as the blockade. Scarcely a ship could enter Germany, except from a Baltic port, without undergoing the close scrutiny of our examining officers. Consequently, before the war, had been in progress for many months. All kinds of shortages were noticed, particularly on the industrial side. Fortunately for them, the Germans are an inventive race, and when there was a shortage of anything, their clever scientists invented something else that would do almost as well. What British soldier does not remember those marvelous things that the Germans made during the last year of war out of paper, sand, bags, string, and rope, all of them quite effective enough for their purpose. Now, the German government had eased the public mind on the question of these shortages, which later in the war spread to food, by saying that although Germany was in a fairly bad state, the Allied countries, and particularly England, were in hopeless condition. It was pointed out that scarcely a ship could enter Britain at all owing to the activities of the submarines, that the British nation was slowly starving, that the British army rations had been vastly cut down, that all sorts of things were completely lacking, that British commerce was being ruined for lack of essentials, and so on and so on. It was a tale easy to tell and easy to believe, and there were few Germans who in the early weeks of 1918 were not fully convinced that on account of German submarine activities, Britain's plight was appalling. And now, advancing so suddenly into the British front area, the Germans on the spot had found that all the stories told to them were merely fairy tales. Here, every mile or so, was a canteen stocked with luxuries such as they had only vaguely imagined. Here was equipment lying about in quality far surpassing anything that Germany could show. Here, in the water tanks, by the wayside, were brass taps, used for most ordinary purposes, whereas the Germany brass was almost as precious as gold. Propaganda is a dangerous weapon, however skillfully it is used, and one always liable to hurt the user as much as the recipient. Lies always come home to roost. Furthermore, their effect is far-reaching and never-ending. Traveling about Central Europe today, I find that Germans have forgiven the English for most of what they did during the war, for all the German casualties that they inflicted, even for the blockade. But one thing they can never forget, that campaign of lies and calumny, which went by the name of propaganda. They have forgotten about British successes on the Somme and at Arras. They have forgiven us for beating them in the last 100 days of the war, but they have not forgotten, and will not forget for a long time, those lies which we circulated to the world about atrocities, corpse factories, and the like. Bullets only damage the body. Propaganda wounds and taints the mind. In this instance, however, it was the German propaganda which recoiled against its authors, and nothing is so upsetting to the morale of a grown man as when he finds that he has been lied to like a child, and has believed lies as a child will, never suspecting that his seniors are deceivers. A man in such case is first furious with himself, Then, as a natural corollary, he turns to the other side and loses his confidence in his superiors once and for all. Now, in spite of all that has been said and assumed, German discipline was not entirely founded upon force. To a very large extent, in fact, it depended upon the confidence which the men had in their officers, as it must always depend in any army. It must be added, in parenthesis, that this confidence was generally very well founded, for it is admitted on all hands, even in France, that the German army was the best officered of all. I think it'll be generally admitted that if an army, even composed of brave men, is to fight its way to victory, two things are essential: good officers and good food. Of general officers, the Germans had an ample supply, but of junior officers there was, towards the end of the war, a very serious deficiency, as in the Allied armies, owing to the large casualties among the subaltern class. Even then, however, the German officer type was particularly good, and the promoted non-commissioned officers in most cases did excellent work, but due largely to the effect of the strangling blockade imposed and maintained by the British Navy. German food supplies began to be seriously diminished. Only the Romanian campaign in the autumn of 1916 relieved the situation. Otherwise, Germany might have been brought to her knees, despite the subsequent collapse of Russia. But by the beginning of 1918, things were really serious. In all the towns, large numbers of people were perilously near starvation point. It was not a question of lack of money, but of actual material. Essential goods were tremendously scarce, and although the soldiers at all times received preferential treatment, it became essential to cut down their rations from time to time, until the food which the German soldier received during the last year of the war bore no comparison to that issued at its outbreak, either in quality or quantity. Now, although it will be agreed that the Napoleonic axiom about an army fighting on its stomach is one of the truest in war, yet the German spirit was so strong that it might have been maintained so long as the belief was firmly founded that the enemy was in even worse fettle, for there is no better sedative to offer the dispirited men. But the moment that the truth was revealed, the moment that the breakthrough into the British back areas showed to hundreds of thousands of Germans that so far from starving, the British soldiers were very much better fed and clothed than themselves, then the whole basis of the propaganda recoiled with a crash upon its instigators. The report of the scenes in the Somme area traveled like lightning along the front. We actually had applications from divisions in Alsace asking to be transferred to the Somme battle area, a request, I may say, which was very seldom received. On examination it was found that officers and men alike were impelled by the desire to get among this land of plenty, of which they had heard so much. Captain Liddell Hart, wittily, but no less searchingly, suggests that had the British High Command had the necessary imagination, it would have paid them to have organized conducted tours of German behind the British front, and then have sent them home to tell their friends, and there is more than an amusing fancy in his suggestion. During the next few months, as I have said, I sent messages from time to Mason by many and varied methods, giving information and even details of projected operations, yet at the same time I had ceased in my own mind to regard this, important and essential as it might be, as my main task, for by now I was firmly ensconced on the operation side. I had worked my way, I think I may claim it, into the esteem of Ludendorff at any rate. He frequently employed me as one of his traveling officers, a thing he never did unless he had complete confidence in a man. This was the opportunity for which I had been working for so long. The mind of the enemy commander, that was my object. Ludendorff was the enemy commander for really practical purposes. I now had at least some sort of entry to his mind. It was up to me to widen the breach so that my suggestions might be heeded and considered. Obviously, it was a thing to be done very, very carefully, and if I were to detail the slow stages by which I helped to weaken Ludendorff's confidence in the magnificent army which he commanded, it would make a tremendous book in itself, a book, however, of more interest to psychologists than to the general reader. Nor do I claim that my suggestions would have carried much weight unless they were backed by a solid foundation. Ludendorff wanted not merely opinions, but facts. Fortunately, the events of the spring of 1918 gave me facts in plenty. The real point is that at least 2 opinions can be based on every fact. I would visit a division which for some reason had not done well in an attack, and would report on its condition. My report would err on the pessimistic side. I was very careful not to overdo things. Whenever I could, I got the divisional commander to agree with me, and this was not so difficult as I had expected, particularly as I generally visited the division immediately after a general action, when morale was usually at its lowest ebb. So very slightly, and I hope subtly, I exaggerated the effect of the decreased food rations on the men. I exaggerated, too, the incidents I had seen in the Somme area, where orgies of loot had held up the success of the advance. I must admit that at first Ludendorff found this difficult of credence. I reported to the same effect after a visit to the Georgette attack on the Lys, where again I saw men looting farms instead of advancing against an enemy who scarcely existed except in the mind of the semi-starved victors. This time Ludendorff's confidence was shaken, but when, on the occasion of the third great attack in May, when the Germans advanced to the Marne, I painted the same picture, this time supporting my reports by means of photographs which I took at Soissons, of soldiers lying drunk in the road or rolling about the streets with their officers vainly trying to get control over men who had had sudden access to unlimited stocks of free champagne. Then even Ludendorff was convinced, although he had a purely military mind. even that appreciated something of the elements of human psychology, and he knew that there was something radically wrong in such a state of affairs, which could never have existed in 1914. If I wished for a complimentary analysis of my influence upon Ludendorff's mind, I could not find a better than in his memoirs, where the gradual change in his opinions is seen. Sometimes he is very contradictory, quite confident of defeat and victory almost in the same phrase. But the truth is that in his own mind Ludendorff knew by midsummer of 1918 that only a miracle could bring Germany victory by battle. He was, however, quite confident then that he could hold out well into 1919, presenting an unbroken front to the enemy, knowing the critical military and political state of affairs in France. He hoped, and with justice, that long before America made itself felt in any force, the French front would crumble, for in truth it must be admitted that at this time French morale was not tremendously high. When we discussed the question afterwards, we decided that our attack ought to have been directed against the French front, and not against the British, for the British, although inferior as technical soldiers to the French, have a tenacity which the more highly excitable Latin races never possess. But the British front held even after being broken. That might not have been the case had the offensive been directed against the French. This was the theme on which I improvised continuously. In my summaries of reports from armies and other units, I emphasized on every possible occasion the low morale of the troops. I was thrilled at my contest with the great military mind opposing me, unconscious of the duel though it might be. I looked back upon my earlier efforts at Lens as a mere melodramatic episode. This was real work, brain work. Never have I written so carefully as I did then, rewriting reports, until every word should have a subtle meaning. Gradually I saw some slight result of my labors. No longer was Ludendorff the supremely confident man of a few months ago. No longer were his staff with him in his confidence, for I had discussed all kinds of matters of morale most seriously with them. Other visiting officers had confirmed our reports. They had not put things quite so strongly as I had, but I was able to enlarge on the ideas which they presented. Early in June, I was able to write to Mason a letter containing the perfectly innocuous sentence, "Our affairs have been in rather a bad way, but seem to be mending rapidly. I think that the tide has turned." Mason has told me since that he thought my opinion at that time to be very premature, for the second battle of the Marne was still in progress, and the Germans had conquered huge tracts of territory. The final offensive of July 15th had yet to come, but when it did, it was almost a complete failure. For the first time, the German army, in the flush of its 1918 attacks, achieved almost naught. On that day, the initiative passed from Ludendorff and was taken up by Foch. Perhaps I do not possess a military mind, and maybe it was the fact that I wanted this to happen that made me see it 3 days before Ludendorff. He was still toying with the idea of a grand final offensive against the British on the Flanders front, yet his confidence was greatly weakened. A few weeks before, he had affirmed definitely that the Marne attack was only a sideshow to distract attention. Then the greatest battle would begin. Now he was hesitant, wondering if he could really keep up the onslaught. Naturally, I prompted him as best I could in his decision, and on July 18th, Foch gave me a helping hand in his counterattack, which, although it failed to destroy the German forces in the huge salient which the battle had created, did at least have a decisive influence on the future conduct of the war. The effect was electrical. Even those among my fellow staff officers who had believed that I was a little too pessimistic now walked about with terribly serious faces. They knew from the wastage of troops in the previous battle that the whole idea of mounting any other great attack must now be abandoned. I seized my advantage and rammed it home. We were sent out to visit the divisions and report on their condition. If I had the slightest foundation, I reported that the division was in bad fettle and badly needed a rest. My colleagues may not have been quite so drastic as I was, but it was perfectly true that a good many of the divisions were completely exhausted. Yet obviously the line must be held. So many divisions were reported to Ludendorff as being unfit for active warfare that he was seriously concerned. For the moment I thought he was almost rattled, yet he soon recovered. Instantly he adopted urgent measures. More men must be combed out from civilian occupations. The army in Russia must be reduced to a mere fringe, however dangerous the operation might be. The German stiffening in the Balkans must be withdrawn, or at least reduced. The Austrians must be prepared to lend divisions and artillery. I could not help but admire his stern spirit when I saw the way in which he faced up to the crisis. He was not like some other generals I knew who only welcomed cold facts when they supported their own theories. His difficulties were enough to dispirit any man. In the Allied counterattack on July 18th, not every point on the German front had been so firmly defended as it ought to have been. Food, lack of confidence, propaganda, all these things together, if you will, had caused the German soldier to lose that nerve and spirit which had so distinguished him throughout the war. Or maybe he felt that this great salient was dangerous, that he might so easily be cut off from his friends, or more likely he thought, as he certainly did a little later, that all these attacks, after all, had brought nothing. He had something of the sudden realization which the French experienced in 1917, when Nivelle promised them immediate victory, and did not win it. With the German soldier the contrast was even more emphatic, for he had won tremendous victories, victories whose likes had not been seen throughout the whole of the war, and yet peace seemed to be no nearer. I should emphasize, however, that at this time Ludendorff was still confident that he could at least fight the war to a draw, that although he might not march to victory, he could sell the enemy ground which he occupied so dearly, yard by yard, that the enemy would be glad to offer him equable terms of peace. As the days passed and no enemy offensive developed, he was confirmed in that view. Continually I strove by subtle suggestion to destroy his confidence in his own ideas. Day by day I wished something would happen, for I began to fear that Ludendorff's reasoning was right, for although the Germans had lost heavily, perhaps the Allied losses were so severe as to prohibit the resumption of the offensive. If the Allies were going to sit on their heels and wait for the Americans, I thought that his opinion about the French might be only too solidly founded, for interrogation of French prisoners recently captured supported everything he said, so his confidence gradually regained its forceful purpose. The rest of July passed without even a minor crisis of defense. The German army recuperated to some slight extent, on the surface at any rate, from the mauling which it had received. Ludendorff was cheered to see the apparent recovery in its condition. He went so far as to twit me about my pessimism of a few weeks back, and even criticized my lack of psychological understanding, in that I had failed to realize how quickly troops can regain their strength and spirit if given a little rest. While professing to him the liveliest satisfaction, I was actually gravely agitated. It looked as if all my insidious work was being undone. My great scheme had failed. The mind of the enemy commander was as firm as ever. In the last week in July, in fact, he so recovered his early confidence that he ordered staff preparation for 4 fresh attacks, including the postponed Flanders offensive. True, these attacks were on a very moderate scale compared with his earlier anticipations, but he calculated that they would show the Allied leaders that the German army was still a tremendously formidable fighting force, and that any hope of a runaway victory, Americans or no Americans, could be thrown to the wind. Eagerly he threw himself into a new reorganization of the Western Front, by which the 2nd, 18th, and 19th Armies were to be formed into a new group commanded by General von Bonn. Then suddenly, out of the blue, came surprise and disaster. Ludendorff writes in his memoirs, as late as the first days in August, I was able to tell General von Bonn that I hoped to hand him over a well-consolidated line. Unfortunately, events proved me wrong, and while still occupied with these readjustments, the blow of the 8th August fell upon me. August the 8th was the black day of the German army in the history of this war, writes Ludendorff in his memoirs. What does he mean? Rawlinson's attack to the east of Amiens came as a tremendous surprise, not even I, receiving occasional information from Mason, had the faintest idea of its coming. The surprise was certainly a nasty shock, but Ludendorff had been surprised many times before, so that was not his reason for classing the day as decisive. It was a considerable British victory too. The British advanced 12 miles and captured 21,000 prisoners, easily their best success of the war, and yet poor in comparison to the German attacks of the spring. So the reason did not lie in this. The battle did not in any way weaken the German line. It merely flattened out the nose of the Somme salient, and not in the slightest degree did it threaten the German communications. Certainly, from this point of view, Ludendorff had not the slightest cause for alarm. Why then does he say that August 8th was the black day of the German army? I think I can supply the right answer. After the first reports came in, I was sent with 1 or 2 other members of the staff, working independently, to the scene of battle, to ascertain what had happened and to report as to the local situation. I found that while some units had played their part well, the resistance of others had been of the feeblest character. That is, according to previous German standards, their commanders were very dispirited, and I encouraged them in their mood. I so played on the nerves of one army commander, in fact, that only the personal intervention of Prince Ruprecht prevented him from ordering an immediate retirement behind the Somme. I was the first on the scene. Other members of the staff, in some cases, visited the same units later, nor did they find their mood less chastened. So I hurried back to Spa and made my report, as others followed, all to the same effect, though not so forceful as mine. Maybe I grinned inwardly, although my countenance was apparently bathed in gloom. Ludendorff asked me a lot of questions, then sat silent. Thinking hard, I looked at him, and decided that the moment had come for me to play one of my trump cards. What is the use of being an actor if you don't act? So, with my head in my hands, leaning over the report that I had made, I burst into tears. It is not an easy thing to do. Any actor will tell you that. You have to work yourself up inwardly to produce any realistic effect. At any rate, I did it well enough to startle Ludendorff. He strode over to me and asked what on earth was the matter. I replied brokenly that I was afraid for our cause, that I was now sure that we had lost the war. If he thought this would injure my work, I added tentatively, of course he could dismiss me from his staff and send me to the front, where I would hope to die bravely. I played the part of a man completely broken, and any psychologist will tell you that if a certain type of man, whose nerves are already frayed to the limit, finds himself in the company of a broken man, he is very liable to break himself. Ludendorff was of that type. His outward calmness was misleading to the world. He was not a real man of iron. Many times I had observed the chinks in his armor, had seen him roused to fury, so uncontrolled that I had expected him to fall in a fit. So I judged that Ludendorff could be rattled, and played my trick. I would never have tried it on Hindenburg, whose solidity was immovable, but an excitable man is always liable to break if only temporarily. Ludendorff did. There were no tears. There was no loss of control. He sat staring at the report and at me, making up his mind. There was no hope wherever he looked, not one spark of brightness to which he might turn for light and consolation. And watching him, my heart burned within me, for I knew that I had got him. Yet all the time I must admit to a small sense of shame that I, by what might be called underhand methods, had undermined one of the strongest spirits which the war had produced. How far did I really influence him? Did I really get inside his mind, shake his confidence? Ludendorff himself supplies the answer. In his memoirs, you may read this paragraph: "The report of a staff officer I had sent to the battlefield as to the condition of those divisions which had met the first shock of the attack on the 8th perturbed me deeply. Whole bodies of our men had surrendered to single troopers or isolated squadrons. Retiring troops meeting a fresh division going bravely into action had shouted out things like 'black legs' and 'you're prolonging the war,' expressions that were to be heard again later. The officers in many instances had lost their influence and allowed themselves to be swept along with the rest. Everything I had feared, and of which I had so often been given warning, had here in one phase become a reality. Our fighting power had suffered. I had no hope of finding a strategic expedient whereby to turn the situation to our advantage. The fate of the German people was for me too high a stake. The war must be ended." The war must be ended. Those were Ludendorff's words to me as he rose from his chair. The war must be ended. Oh, how I retained my gloomy countenance, I don't know. The war must be ended. Ludendorff walked slowly from the room. I knew where he was going, to offer his resignation to Hindenburg. The field marshal would naturally refuse to accept it, yet this was definitely the beginning of the end. 3 more August 8ths, maybe one more, and Germany might be beaten, for the mind of the enemy commander was already beaten. The war must be ended. Another officer of the General Staff joined me. So agitated was my mental state that I cannot remember who it was. With deepest gloom I told him what was happening. He sat biting his lip hard, yet my shocks were not yet over. In less than an hour Ludendorff returned. We both looked at him expectantly. The field marshal takes a more optimistic view of the situation than I do, he announced. Nevertheless, I am convinced that I am right. I have prepared the report for His Majesty. You, Newman, will conference on the situation with His Majesty will doubtless attend. I read that report on my journey, taking a spare envelope with me to allay any possible suspicion. I found the Kaiser already perturbed. He has since confessed that the failure of the June 15th offensive disintegrated his hopes. Ludendorff's appreciation was gloomy enough, yet did not go far enough for my liking. There was no use of that phrase burned on my brain. The war must be ended. I could see the influence of the more stolid Hindenburg, yet there was no opportunity to tamper with it, nor did I consider the risk worthwhile. Ludendorff's mind was my quarry, not the Kaiser's. But with what joy did I hear that beloved phrase again, for the Kaiser, after asking me a number of questions, was calmer than Ludendorff, yet his conclusion was the same. He was never so dignified as when he said to me, very quietly and composedly, "I see that we must strike a balance. We are at the end of our resources. The war must be ended. The war must be ended." The wheels of my car bumped out this joyous sentence 1,000 times as I speeded toward SPY. At first I was all jubilation, could hardly restrain myself from singing aloud. Then I began to think. What next? What should be my next move? The one essential was that the Allies should mount a succession of attacks. Immediately, there must be no resting on laurels. I must get a message through to Mason at once. Yet would it receive sufficient heed? I had by this time discovered that not all my messages were considered as important as I thought they were. Ought I to get back to England at once? Then I could ram home my arguments. Maybe I could get hold of a copy of Ludendorff's report. Other things, too. I knew that the Bulgarians were wanting to walk home, that the Austrian front was now a mere eggshell, to collapse at the first crack. Yes, I was tempted to go at once. If the Allies did not ram home their advantage at once, if the winter could be gained, then Ludendorff might regain his lost nerve. Yet, at the same time, it was vastly important for me to remain at his side against such an eventuality. Surely, Foch would see the true state of affairs. Surely such an offensive spirit as his would never miss its chance. So I argued with myself, deciding at last that it was my duty to stay. Yet fate settled the argument for me in another way. I could not grumble. Fortune had been very kind to me ever since Lens. The following day I was ordered to return to the battlefield. Commanders were rattled. There was no cohesion. I was to bully or persuade them into renewed confidence. The battle was in its last stages. German skeleton forces held an improvised line, but the British advance had exhausted itself, except in one or two isolated sectors. But when local commanders suggested withdrawals, I agreed. Sometimes I protested, but always agreed. Near Proyart, I went up to the front line myself to see the position. I really wanted to be sure that the British patrols were lively enough in following up the withdrawals. They were too lively for me. All my plans went west in one unlucky second. With an orderly as guide, I scoured a rough trench which the orderly swore was the front line. Where were its defenders? Surely they had not retired without orders. I decided that we must move forward to explore. There was no sign of the British, but the moment we crawled cautiously from the trench, a machine gun spluttered. My orderly fell dead by my side, and I crashed to the ground, with a bullet through my thigh. For some moments I was half stunned by the fall. Then I pulled myself together, ripped open my breeches, and bandaged the wound roughly with my field dressing. It was a trying process, for suddenly I felt strangely weak, and took a long time. I had scarcely finished when I saw two khaki figures crawling along the ground, 100 yards to my right. Yes, the British patrols were alive. "Hullo there," I called out, yet scarcely recognizing my own voice. "Come here." One of the men left his companion and hurried towards me. "What's up?" he asked. Then suddenly and astonishingly finding that I was a German, he raised his rifle. "Don't shoot, you fool," I cried. "Help me with my wound. I'm English." "Well, I'll be damned," he ejaculated. Admittedly, he might well consider himself so. "Come on, Nobby," I heard his companion call. "What's up?" Why, there's a bleedin' Jerry Horsifer what says he's English. What shall I do with 'em? Oh, you can't believe a word them Jerrys say. Put 'em out of mess. But he's wounded. All the more reason. The second man had now come close to me. The NCO, who taught him to accompany bayonet fighting with ferocious expressions, had done his work well. "So, you're English, are yer?" he sneered. "Yes, I am," I declared. "I must get to your headquarters at once. One of you find your officer and ask him to send a stretcher party for me. You got some bloody oats," he comforted. "Stretcher parties for bloody Jerrys, eh? Come on, Nobby. We got to get on. We want to get into the canteen area before them bloody Aussies get there. I'll put 'em out of his misery. Then there'll be no shootin' in the back for us." He raised his rifle. I was really frightened. I had never anticipated this. "Don't be a bloody fool," I yelled. "I tell you I'm English. Don't I talk like an Englishman?" "'E does that, Bill," said Nobby. "Oh, English is easy to learn. That don't mean nuffin'," the other commented. "I expect 'e's took a language course." I saw his finger on the trigger. Was it sheer fright, or did I have an inspiration? "Don't you pull that trigger, you pig, or you'll be, well, sorry for it for the rest of your life. You pull that trigger and you'll get a bayonet shoved right up your—" The man's jaw dropped. So did his rifle, to my relief. "Blimey, Bill, he's English all right," quoth the astounded Nobby. "No Jerry could swear like that." "No, they don't teach you those words in language courses," I put in. Even the reluctant Bill was half convinced. "Well, I'll be," he exclaimed. "I don't know what to make of this. Anyway, get me an officer," I ordered, now quite confident again. "Yes, that's the best thing," Nobby said to Bill. "You stop here, and I'll go and fetch Mr. Maynard." "No," I contradicted. "You stay here, and Bill will fetch Mr. Maynard." I was not at all keen on being left alone with the bloodthirsty Bill. He might change his mind again. "Anyway, tip up your revolver," he ordered. "There's going to be no dirty work." I handed over my automatic pistol, and he examined it critically. "Ah, that's a good 'un," he commented. "I can get 30 francs for that. 50-50, eh, Nobby?" "Bowie vin blanc, eh? I won't take your helmet. There ain't no sell for them now. All the ASC has got one already." He shambled awkwardly off. Nobby began to ask me questions, and his eyes opened wide at my replies. Half an hour passed before Bill returned, bringing with him a youthful officer. He could not have been more than 18. He was very puzzled, not knowing whether to believe me or not, and of course I could understand his bewilderment. However, he agreed to the obvious thing. I must be taken back at once. He had brought more men with him, but there was no stretcher at hand, so, with my arms around the necks of two hefty cockneys, I hobbled on one leg from my last battlefield. Nobby and Bill stared at me as I went. I heard Bill explaining me to one of the newcomers. "Blimey," he exclaimed, "he swears like a sergeant major. Never 'eard such a flow since old Slogger found as the pack had got 5 aces in it." Bad language is of no social or commercial value. yet I do believe it saved my life that day. Chapter 8. The rest of my story is quickly told. As soon as I had reached civilization, I was rushed in an ambulance to Montreal. There, while a surgeon was probing for the bullet, an excruciatingly painful process, an officer of Sir Douglas Haig's staff was asking me innumerable questions. The next day Sir Douglas himself came to see me. As fate had now settled my dilemma for me, I took up the alternative with vigor. I described the actual position, the condition of the German army, reports from Bulgaria and Austria above all, the state of Ludendorff's mind. I insisted that attacks should be rammed home, that the war must be finished before winter set in, before the Germans could retire to the frontier, where they would defend their native soil with all their old spirit. Haig gave me confidence. He was a poor talker and said little, but no one could mistake his tenacity. The British army had once or twice regretted it, but now he was on the right lead. He would hold on, nothing would make him swerve. I was sure of that, and as he pressed my hand I was very happy. The war would have to be ended. Incidentally, my story may perhaps throw light on another curiosity, which has excited some critics. Why Haig, in August 1918, sent home urgent requisitions for mobile troops, reporting to the government that the character of the conflict had changed, and that a decision was imminent. At this time, Foch was still planning his grand offensive for the spring of 1919. I stayed in hospital near Montreal, so as to be available for consultation by officers of the staff. Yet for me, the war was really over. I'd done my job. All that was left was to gather in a sheath of decorations, including some foreign medals of which I had never even heard. As I lay on my bed, my leg rapidly healing, I thought back over my exciting days, those acute moments of exhilaration and despair at Lens, the thrill when I first fitted myself into Adolf's place, the Verdun carbine, those sensational seconds with Hansi and her baby, my fight with Schleicher. Looking over my memoirs now that I have completed them, I am afraid that they do not really show my work in true perspective. My exploit at Lens might have been useful. Many of the messages I sent from German GHQ were certainly invaluable. I do not think that any other spy in any country obtained and sent home so much information, for no one else had all my advantages, yet military historians will agree when I claim that all these are minor compared with the task which I describe at comparatively short length, because it does not make particularly interesting reading. My influence on Ludendorff was worth 100 wrecked troop trains. The aim in warfare is still the mind of the enemy commander. My story is finished. I have already gathered up the threads of its earlier incidents. I repeat, I am not ashamed of having served my country in the way I did. Spying is no more ignoble than shooting. The cause is the thing that counts. In similar circumstances, I would do the same again, except that now, I am afraid, I have no longer the controlled nerves I used to have. For the reader will have judged for himself the continual nerve strain my task imposed upon me. Firmly ensconced as I was, one ill-judged word might have led to suspicion and death. Since then I have played in some long runs, but none so lengthy as my part at German GHQ from November 1915 to August 1918. By the end of September I could return to England. No one had need of me any more. Under a continuous series of hammer blows, the German front had crumbled. The end could not be many days away. My flesh was clean, and the wound had no complications. Very soon I would be hobbling about. So I went home tremendously happy. I had not yet seen Suzanne. Maybe my head was a little swelled. Maybe I strode too vehemently over my triumphs. Maybe I put too high a valuation on my services. Maybe I needed a corrective. In any case, I got it. I proposed to take my whole family on a long holiday, so wrote to the War Office about my account. I had drawn no pay since October 1915, so they must owe me a tidy sum, I calculated. But a very zealous clerk at the War Office pointed out that, although I had drawn no pay from the War Office, I had been paid all along by the Germans. Thus he proposed to credit me only with the difference between the two rates of pay. I had to laugh. I needed an anticlimax like that to bring me to earth, to return me to the world as an ordinary sane and sober citizen.